Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Certification by Analysis in Healthcare, In-Silico Tests, Trials of Medical Products for the Digital Era. My name is Jo Potts from NAFEMS and I'll be your host for the next hour. I would now like to introduce our presenters for today. Professor Alejandro Frangi is the Bicentennial Turing Chair in Computational Science and Health Sciences Schools. Alex is the Director of Christabel Pankhurst Institute of Health Technologies Research and Innovation. He's also the Royal Academy of Engineering Chair in Emerging Technologies with a focus on precision computational medicine for in-silico trials of medical devices. He is an Alan Turing Institute Fellow. And Dr. Pooja Miles is a Director of the UK Medicines of Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, MHRA, Specialist Real-World Data Research Service, Clinical Practice Research Data Link, CPRD. She trained as a public health specialist and epidemiologist following her initial clinical training and practice. Pooja is a Fellow of the Faculty of Public Health UK, a Senior Fellow of the Higher Educational Academy UK, and holds a PhD in epidemiology. Her current research areas include real-world data research, data quality, synthetic data, and AI explainability. I will now hand over to Alex in the first instance for the main part of today's event and the technical presentation on certification by analysis in healthcare, in silico tests, trials of medical products for the digital era. Alex, I will hand you the ball. You're now the presenter, Alex.
Super. Thanks a lot, Jo, and team and others from NAFEMS for inviting us to talk today. So if you could just confirm that you can see my screen.
Perfect. Thank you, Alex.
Super. So I'm not supposing today that everybody is familiar with the concepts of in-silico trials and in-silico test. So what I would like to do today is to introduce some of those concepts and then try to explain where we are in the process of certification in this area. So I'd like to briefly summarize what the paradigm shift is in medicine. So for those of you who come from other sectors, you may find some of the comments fairly, practices are fairly common in other domains. However, in medicines, they are emerging at the moment. But at the same time, there are very specific circumstances and characteristics for the medical domain that make it quite unique. I'll try to explain a few case studies, one in particular with more detail and some others in a more, glossing over them to give a bit of sense of breadth as well. And then I'll try to explain why we need certification in this area and what are the efforts in this domain. So computational medicine is essentially the use of computational science and engineering in the context of medicine. And when we talk to patients and the general public, we tend to explain that what essentially we do is, with these techniques, crunch numbers that help to predict and personalize the treatment very much the same way that we use GPS in the case of in driving, but for their health journey. Now, what is particular characteristics of the use of digital twins in medicine is that, unlike in many other domains where we tend to have a real-time connection between the digital twin and the data sets or the physical entity, in the case of medicines, that is not always possible or easy to do because of the lack of real-time connectivity we have with the sources of healthcare data. But there are other challenges that are related to the integration of very complex data ranging from genetic, clinical, lifestyle information, but also the complexity of modeling biological systems. On the other hand, sometimes we're not interested in necessarily having a replica of a particular individual, but what we are more interested in having replicas of subjects that could be arising from the distribution of a real human population. And we tend to call digital chimeras or chimeras for short. So I'm going to try to focus now on what is specific in terms of testing and trials in the medical product lifecycle and why this is important. So to motivate that and to give a sense of the importance of this area, in a study that was done a few years ago by a group of investigative journalists, there was a group of about 10 devices that were studied that over a period of 10 years led to approximately 80,000 deaths and about 1.7 million of serious adverse effects in the US alone. This led, together with other reasons in the UK, to what is known as a Cumberland report, where there was an independent review of the agency in the UK that provides assessment for medicines and to some extent medical devices as well. And the title of that report is First Do Not Harm. And I would like to hopefully convey today that the way a group of people in the context of the In-Silico UK network, we understand this First Do Not Harm is start with simulations first, where possible. So this has massive implications as well. So if we could accelerate the time to market, this will provide less risk to patients, potentially better outcomes for patients, but also improve the device designs, reduce the R&D cost, and reduce the need for compromising animal welfare. In the context of the UK alone, a number of the trials are going elsewhere worldwide, partly and not exclusively, partly, but because of the challenges in general that there are with regulatory approval. But we believe that more broadly, these sort of technologies of modeling and simulation can help not only the final regulatory phase, but also the whole life cycle of the medical products. And there is an expectation that if we could reduce the current lengths of medical device trials that can be between 6 and 7 years easily, and between 10 and 150 million in terms of cost, depending on the type of device and the size of the trial, this could produce massive savings in time and cost. Now, what does it mean, regulatory evidence? Well, regulatory evidence, for those of us who come from an academic and scientific background, is essentially scientific evidence. And the way to generate scientific evidence in the regulatory space is traditionally based on 3 sources of evidence: bench testing, animal experiments, human testing, and what we advocate is the need of working also in the area of virtual trials or with virtual participants. Now, something that is very important to emphasize, and is never enough to emphasize, is that all of those are models of particular interventions. Both in-silico models are models per se, but so are human trials, animal trials, and bench testings. There is always an assumption that the insights and the knowledge we gain through those experiments is revealing something about the wider behavior of those devices in real patients' circumstances. And fundamentally, they're all wrong. They all have limitations, but at the same time, all of them can be particularly useful in specific circumstances. So the question here is not whether computational modeling is fully replacing the other techniques, but where and in what conditions they can provide an advantage or a complement to those other sources of evidence. So fundamentally, in-silico testing or in-silico trials is computer-based tests or trials where we use detailed prediction models in very highly controlled virtual conditions or virtual cohorts. And I want to emphasize that these conditions try to represent operational conditions in the target populations that we intend to use those devices or those drugs, and also that these approaches have to be distinguished with a different concept that is called virtual trials in some contexts, or distributed trials, which are trials that are based on retrospective analysis of real-world evidence or real-world data sets. So here we talk about more mechanistic type models where possible. Now, if we can do that, this has a number of advantages. It allows us also to understand better the impact of those devices potentially in a much larger population of patients, where we could reach out to specific demographics that could be otherwise difficult in a human trial because of the size of those trials and the access to particular patients. Now, why this is important? Because the way we currently develop, or the whole concept of developing medical products, presumes that in early phases we have so we have here on the x-axis is the life cycle of a particular medical product, and in the y-axis is the number of problems that we can identify in a particular design and eventually have to resolve. Now, what happens is that the deeper you go into this pipeline, the more expensive it comes to solve the unit error or the unit problem with your design. But at the same time, when we are in early phases of the design, we don't have still a product, so commercially there is very little attractive. And if you are a startup or a spin-off that is depending on investors to progress your product to the next phases, you will be under a huge amount of pressures to generate evidence early on. Now, this implies that if you do that with physical experiments, usually bench testing and maybe some animal testing at that point, the cost probably of a seed round will fully go into those experiments, and you will have a very limited amount of designs that you can explore within those experiments. Then once you progress to human trials, in the current scenario, which is this one in the dark blue line, the things that can potentially go wrong start going wrong, and at that time going back to the drawing board is very expensive. So what In-Silico trials try to do is actually to identify earlier on through modeling and simulation those interventions that are unlikely to be successful in subsequent human trials. So we may still need those human trials as confirmatory events. It's not about necessarily removing those, but it's improving the success rate of those trials at a later stage by the risk in early stages of the design process. Now, I shouldn't tell you, many of you who are from non-healthcare communities, that this is something that in other domains is quite commonly done, and in particular, if we think, for instance, in the aerospace. And sometimes when talking to more healthcare audiences, a typical comment that I tend to get is, well, but these are very different domains. And as an engineer myself, I try to explain that these are actually very mission-critical systems which are highly regulated, highly multi-scale, highly complex, with a huge amount of uncertainty in them as well, which is essentially the same characteristics that we tend to have in the human domain. Perhaps the particularly challenged domain is the high level of uncertainty we have in human testing, because a lot of the parameters of our system that are not human-made are actually complex to estimate and to narrow down. So to give you also an example of a particular application of this, so this is what we call a brain aneurysm, and we have a flow that goes through the vessel and usually could pressurize this aneurysm and produce an hemorrhagic stroke. So there are different therapies for those coils, flow stents that essentially could contain the coils not to come out, especially in wide neck aneurysms, and also flow diversions, who are low porosity stents that actually can reduce the flow, stagnate the flow, and promote coagulation. So all of those devices, what they're trying to do is contain clotting, produce selective clotting, and reduce the circulation of blood within the aneurysm itself. Now, over a period of 30 years, we have fundamentally relatively little changes in the fundamental principles of those devices. And this speaks a lot to the incremental nature in many areas of medical products, precisely because of the challenges of the whole R&D process and the costs associated with that. That means that after 30 years, still we have in this particular device important complication rates and mortality rates. And we could utilize similar tools to the ones that we use in the aerospace, automotive, and other sectors. So hopefully what I explained so far is that we want to go from a current situation where animal, human, and bench testing is dominating a lot of the evidence sources, and with very little computational modeling, to a situation where we reduce the amount of those, we replace where possible and where impossible to do a human trial, and we refine the designs of the studies by the use of modeling and simulation. And remember, the goal is not here to remove the need of what we call as pivotal human trials, the ones that do the final approval, but actually to help in coming to that position with a lot more confidence on our innovations. And our view is that in the future, the evidence that we're going to be developing is probably a complex blend of those 4 sources of evidence and perhaps other things that may develop as we progress. To get a sense of the importance of this from an economic impact and from a medical device industry, this is a generic but grounded with a particular example that we can go in details in this presentation, where a particular device using these technologies could get to market about 2 years earlier, reduce the number of patients that were involved into human trials, reduce the cost of the trial because of the number of patients, and increase the amount of devices that were used in patients during those 2 years of going earlier to market, with the consequent sales, but also the consequences in bringing life-saving therapies to patients. So in silico trials are fundamentally systems of models that contain submodels within those, models of the virtual participants and the populations, models of the virtual examinations and the interventions we are interested in, and also models of the virtual readers and outcomes. And there is a number of reports, and I will put one of those, the landscape report that we developed in the In-Silico UK community, on the chat later on, where we have elaborated on, in this particular case, 12 case studies, but there are other similar research done by FDA, where they also have listed another 14 case studies. And some of them are in early phases, where particularly the models are not sufficiently developed, but others are in much mature stage. But the big challenge, and this is where certification is important, is in validating those models and validating the concept of in silico testing as well, so that we can go from the concept that is now an idea to more scaling up. So to give you an idea of the sort of evidence that we are building as a community, this is a first study, one that comes from our own group. We did an independent evaluation of a medical device that is, in this case, by Medtronic, where we developed computational models where from a large data sets of imaging, we constructed anatomical detail models of the vasculature of the brain. For each of those, we developed post-processing and pre-processing pipelines that automatically can go from the images all the way to a 3-dimensional volumetric mesh. We can also model variability in the physiological regime, so the blood pressure, for instance, and the heart rate, and we can create synthetic, hypertensive, and normotensive conditions for those patients. And we can model not only the fluid dynamics, but also the biochemistry of the clotting process that leads to the promotion of the clot formation. And once you have these virtual populations, you can compare pre-treatment with post-treatment space and then clotting subsequently. And then develop the sort of type of a statistical analysis that you could do in most regular trials. So the way we do that is by modeling the device, generating larger scale anatomical models, utilizing machine learning techniques, and analyzing large imaging data sets, and do the same as well from physiological signals, where we can model physiological regimes and also the situations of stress and rest, but also the uncertainty associated with those physiological conditions. And you can also model uncertainty associated with the deployment of those devices, with the material properties, with basically whatever parameter you are unfamiliar with, or that you only know ranges. And of course, you can then put different products or different parametric strips on a particular product and compare all of those. Something which is very important is defining the outcome measure, which in this case is the flow reduction post-intervention. And what you can see is that the average flow reduction after introducing the stent can be very different for different patients, for different physiological regimes of the same patient, and for different devices, all of them having the same geometry and physiological conditions. Now, if you compare this with a pivotal trial from this device, this is a study that took about 8 years from design to completion, 20 to 40 million to an investment, and where there is another two studies that had to be done subsequently before going to market. So this is what is called the PUF trial, which is about 100 patients, but then subsequently there was a similar study. So this is for large aneurysms. And then there was a subsequent study looking to small aneurysms that to see whether they should be treated or not. And then there was ASPIRE, which is an observational study. So in that publication that I showed, what we did is we recreated the virtual populations of those 3 trials. We performed all of the simulations corresponding to that population, and we demonstrated that we could reproduce to a 5% accuracy those results. Also, we could look at what happens when that population will be a normotensive population or a hypertensive population, showing that the outcome measure, the efficacy measure in this case, could vary enormously depending on that particular parameter, which all of those studies couldn't control for because they were talking about a small number of subjects, and they didn't have control over all of those variables. We can also do more nuanced analysis. I'm not going to get into this, describe this slide in detail, but this is showing a specific comparisons for areas and case of failures where we have only anecdotal evidence in the literature. What happens when you have a branch artery, when there are large and giant aneurysms, or when you have high aspect ratios in those aneurysms. And also, we could also start to try to understand some of the evidence that there is in the literature where, for instance, aneurysms that have a side branch, like this one here, you see that in one condition, the side branch produces a clotting, while in the other one it doesn't. So this is variation of time as clotting progresses for the same subject in everything being the same, with the exception that this is normotensive and this is hypertensive. So you could imagine that we could control the pressure of those patients previous to interventions. We might be able to prevent some of these side effects. And this also starts talking about, combination devices where you have drugs to control the pressure plus the device itself to provide the treatment, the primary treatment. Now, I'm going to now gloss over a few other examples. So this is a piece of work actually coming from the group of Pooja that will be speaking later, where they were doing synthetic data, but in this case it's not about anatomical models, but it's of full data sets, and where they're starting to base on large data sets like the CPRD in the UK, and develop high fidelity simulation, synthetic data sets that you can build. Another example from another regulator, in this case FDA, this is an imaging trial where you are comparing 2 techniques, breast tomosynthesis and conventional X-ray angiography. So what you see there is not real images, they're synthetically generated, and where regulators could demonstrate that you can get cheaper, faster, better, safer, and more scalable trials by comparing these 2 therapies in a fully computational way. Here, work by another industrial partner, Zimmer Biomet. So this is showing now the application to preclinical testing. So this is trying to reduce the need to do cadaveric analysis and essentially a stress test, but where rather than using cadaveric models that have all kind of issues associated with the fact that the bones may not necessarily represent real in vivo conditions, you could create more detailed models and then test them in more physiological conditions that represent real data, and potentially also extreme conditions that will be difficult to replicate in vivo. And finally, another example where is a combination of a device, in this case this prosthesis, with also a particular intervention, osteotomy, where you need to cut a piece of the bone and you have a combination of a device and a surgical intervention. So where are we now in terms of certification? And I want to, up front to say that this is a piece of work that is still in development. So there has been a huge amount of work still in the community, but where there is the focus on the coming years probably going to be, in addition to develop more sophisticated models or develop better models in areas where we don't have the basic ones. But what it is important to say is that these areas are in the attention of most regulators. So Pooja will tell you later on the perspective from MHRA, but from the point of view of the European Medicine Agency and FDA, it's coming along in most of their regulatory strategic documents. Still early phases, but at least there is awareness and there is a focus on those. And there is activities going on in some of the regulators that are going into the direction of reducing the reliance on animal testing. There is also communities of practices that are being developing, and I'm focusing here primarily in the Europeans and British ones, although there are other colleagues like MDIC, the Medical Device Innovation Consortiums in the US, that are looking to act as advocates and promote these areas or these disciplines in their respective geographies, but at the same time working between them to promote global harmonization. And in particular, the In-Silico UK that I'm involved and leading has provided quite a bit of work in terms of thought leadership, and we have a Zenodo open access community where you can actually download all of our reports. And in particular, I would like to attract your attention to the landscape report, and Pooja will cover a bit later on the recently published cross-regulatory workshop that we held in the UK. Now, what is coming from all of those conversations with the community? Well, the top three areas that are seen as barriers, you will see that they're all in one way or another related to certification and credibility assessment. So the first one is coming particularly from industry, which is the uncertainty there is in terms of the regulatory acceptance of these new approaches. And I wouldn't say just in-silico methods, in general, sort of new approaches to non-animal testing. The second one, and this is all about having regulatory frameworks in place, and that's why colleagues from industry, from academia and regulators, we are working to the extent that is possible to sort of progress the principles, the practices, the standards to get there. The second one is the scientific maturity and model credibility. To some extent, maturity of the model scientifically can always be developed further, but what is particularly important is the credibility element, which has to do with the existence of pathways for model assessment. And then finally, and related in a way to the other two, is the need for new skills and expertise development. And that's why we're working in In-Silico UK with NAFEMS to develop and a specific adaptation of their competencies frameworks, but particularly for the healthcare domain. Now, there is a lot of work done by governments and by regulators at different levels. So this is a piece of work that is not directly related to healthcare, but I feel it has a lot of very important items in it. It's what is called the Aqua Handbook or Aqua Book, and is a UK government document from 2015 that talks about the principle for quality analysis in analytic models. And by analytics models, essentially they mean computational models. And it's interesting that the principles are proportionality of the response. So the extent of the analytical testing needs to be proportionate to the risk related to that. The second one is that it has to be an assurance throughout the whole life cycle of the medical product. It cannot be something that you do at the very end. The importance of validation and verification, which is something very common for us, but for me it was quite a positive surprise to see this in a government document as one of the key principles. And finally, what they regard as analysis with rigor, that it stands for repeatable, independent, grounded in reality, objective, managing uncertainty, and robust analysis. And these are things that we will all probably agree with as engineers in our community. Now, it's not enough to have principles, and that's why the community is trying to ground those principles in good simulation practices. And there is a recent book that came a few weeks ago that focuses on, is a community effort towards defining good simulation practices with examples and with aspects for considering there. And there is also guidance that is coming up, particularly guidance from the US by FDA, that actually are grounded in standards that come from ASME in this case, so the American Society of Mechanical Engineering, as validations and verification standards. And there are guidelines that have to do about the credibility of computational models, but also about the qualification of the tools that you use to generate that synthetic evidence or that computational evidence. And I'm going to very quickly glance through some of the key elements of this framework, but fundamentally, it's a framework that is a risk-based and evidence credibility assessment. And at high level, it starts, and I'll move to the next slide, it starts by defining what is known as the question of interest, then define the context of use for that particular simulation result, assess the model risk, so what implications has that model and the decisions you're going to make with that model, and how much you're depending solely on the model or other sources. And then there are processes as well to identify what sort of credibility needs to be collected and generated. And then from there, how you take things forward. So I don't have today the time to go into a lot of detail here, but I want to emphasize that these questions of interest are the ones that relate to the specific questions, decisions, of concerns that is being addressed by that particular model. So it should be about the real world device. It's not about the model, but it's what you're going to do with that particular model. So for instance, if I take my example of the flow diversion devices, maybe an example could be what is the performance in flow reduction that you will have past that device under different physiological regimes, and can you actually understand what are the extreme conditions for it? Should also be not overly broad, like is the device safe or is the device performant? And then the context of use is the conditions and assumptions under which you are actually going to execute that particular model. And those had to do with what is model and how the model outputs will help you to answer the questions of interest. And it's where you do an assessment of what are all the modeling assumptions and the modeling inputs and outputs that you do. Now, I also mentioned that this is a risk-based framework where you need to assess on the one side what is the influence of the model that you're going to use. So for instance, is your model, imagine that you want to do a pivotal trial purely dedicated with model where your model influence is enormous, right? And the decision consequence is potentially high because, you know, if every evidence is based on that, you could potentially harm a patient. But what about if you have a situation where you know what happens with that device through a human trial in, say, large aneurysms, and you just want to expand the prescription to a small aneurysms? There you know a lot about that device from a human trial, and there the model influence is lesser. I'm not saying it's low, but it's lesser than in the previous case. So this is what you do through a risk framework, and here the risk framework is defined in terms of the ISO 1400971. It also looks at what evidence you need to generate. So what is the evidence that will support the credibility of a computational model? And there is a number of sources of evidence, ranging from verifying your code all the way to looking at the model plausibility itself, you know, the behaviors that you're generating with a model that may be non-trivially attributable to particular variables like emerging properties and so on. And then finally, once you have that clear, you can decide what are the activities and factors that you need to assess, that you want to do to generate credibility evidence. And that can range you know, from verification, validation, or applicability testing. And also another thing which is important is when you develop those validation scenarios, are they going to be based on previous you need to define what the comparators will be, what is the data you're going to compare against. Is the comparator data prospectively planned or is previously generated? And is your models and your simulations going to be forward-looking, or they're going to be used, you know, in previously generated simulations? For instance, if you're leveraging from another geography. Okay, so with that, I would like to bring my contribution to an end, but I'd like to emphasize that it's not only, or not primarily, I would say at this point, an issue of technology. It's really about a cultural transformation that we are talking here. And that transformation is happening, but needs to engage across all of the stakeholders. And I would like to invite you to contribute to this effort by joining our network and the Slack workspace that we have to that effect. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alex. Pujara, if I pass you the ball, or if I change over to your slides, and just let me know when you want me to advance those slides.
Thanks so much, Jo. So welcome all. And Alex has given you a really nice overview of computer modeling and simulation approaches. And one of the things that he did mention was that when they surveyed people about what are the barriers to adoption of in-silico approaches, one of the top ones were about regulatory uncertainty. So what I'm going to attempt to do today in a very brief period is to just provide some regulatory perspectives on computer modeling and simulation. This is by no means an official regulatory position, but it is just like, again, it is an invitation to let you know that we are open to discussing these methods and what else we need to progress this further. Next slide, please. So Alex mentioned that we along with with Alex's help, we hosted a cross-regulator workshop in the UK, in London, in July of last year on computer modeling and simulation. Now, this was co-organized by the Royal Academy of Engineering and the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency. And we invited representatives from other regulators in the UK from across sectors. So it included the Food Standards Agency, the Health and Safety Executive, the Office of Product Safety and Standards, and also someone who's representing the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory. We also had other representatives from the British Standards Institution, and also we had a keynote from someone in the US FDA, along with industry and academia. So the aim of this workshop was to really promote an understanding of how CMS methods are used and regulated across different sectors, and the enablers barriers to wider adoption within regulatory pathways. Because one of the things we had ascertained even before this workshop was that there are a lot of these barriers and enablers are common across sectors. Next slide, please. So you can read the details in the report, which was signposted by Alex. It's on the In-Silico UK network website. But in summary, what we found was that a lot of regulators were using these approaches and were open to these approaches. So, for example, I'm from the MHRA, which regulates medical products in the UK. And modeling is encouraged as part of new drug applications, particularly when we're looking at physiologically based pharmacokinetic or PBPK modeling. And we're quite open to replacing or reducing reliance on animal studies and clinical trials in this domain. The bigger question is, of course, and I think this is work which is still ongoing, is where in silico methods are appropriate at which stage of the product life cycle and in which scenarios. So it's not a matter of that they will be acceptable in all cases, but there are many cases where these will be suitable and these will be acceptable. In the Food Standards Agency, CMS approaches are used routinely to predict toxicity of chemicals in food to inform safety assessments. And the Health and Safety Executive, again, PBPK modeling is used to assess environmental and occupational risk. The Office for Product Safety, they again use CMS for improved understanding of customer behavior and to support proactive risk identification. In the defense sector, these methods are used to support research and procurement of military equipment, planning, policymaking, and also providing operational advice for real-time deployments. The British Standards Institution is also considering the development of standards in relation to CMS methods in medical devices and health contexts. And the keynote speaker from the US FDA showed and talked about how a set of virtual family models have been developed for whole body thermal, electromagnetic, and fluid dynamic simulations, and how these models have been cited in over 200 regulatory applications. So when you actually look at the landscape, the regulatory landscape, there is a lot of use of these methods. And perhaps it's just a matter of just making people aware that we are open to having discussions on these. Next slide, please. So going back to this question, this kind of concern, which was about uncertainty about regulatory acceptance, with being the biggest barrier to adoption. So these were some of the things we discussed in this workshop, that actually, from a regulatory perspective, the best thing is to focus on where CMS evidence can plug evidence gaps, where they can optimize clinical trial design, where they can reduce the need for unnecessary exposure to an untested intervention or product, which has uncertain benefit, and where you could probably reduce the need for animal testing. And so focusing on plugging evidence gaps is a really good start for proposing these methods. As I've already mentioned, that in the MHRA, CMS evidence is regularly accepted in place of clinical studies as part of new drug applications. Now, we also discussed, quite frankly, that, especially in the healthcare arena, it is premature, we felt, for in silico trials to replace traditional clinical trials fully. So therefore, the focus must be how in silico studies enhance the evidence that regulators currently receive and how evidence gaps can be filled. For example, we know that a lot of clinical trials will not reflect the situation in pediatrics, and or there may be gaps in terms of rare diseases or combination devices, etc. This is where in silico evidence can really be used to enhance existing clinical trial evidence. From a regulatory perspective, and this was across all regulators, demonstration of validation and verification is key. Now, people often ask us, well, can you come up with, these standards and, best practices, etc. And this is something we can talk about maybe in the Q&A or the free discussion section as well. From our perspective, we felt having some high-level principles that could guide model validation, verification, and good simulation practice would be more useful than coming up with really nitty-gritty advice on specific methods to use. Because if we did that, we would very soon be outdated because methods are advancing at such incredible level. When in doubt, at least for the MHRA, I know and I can say that we're very open to industry representatives reaching out to us for scientific advice early. So if you're not sure whether in silico trial or in silico evidence will be accepted in the context of a particular medical product, reach out early, and then, on a case-by-case basis, that can be assessed. Next slide, please. So in terms of regulatory perspective on requirements, this was, again, quite a general discussion across all sectors that we do need standard terminology to describe in silico trials and associated methods. And in fact, there have been examples where people have used the terminology in silico, but they're actually meaning something completely different. So, this is something that needs to be sorted. Validation and verification, again, these are terms which are used in the medical devices domain, while in the EU drug regulatory space, the term qualification is used. And these might seem like trivial matters, but actually, this can lead to a lot of confusion. So we acknowledge that, there needs to be some cleaning up of terminology and some consensus on what's the best terminology to use. Generally speaking, when it comes to computer modeling and simulation, regulators need assurance about the quality and completeness of data used as input parameters for modeling. And any assumptions made in the modeling should be reasonable and grounded in science. And this is especially important in the case of mechanistic models. The models used to generate evidence must be validated. Now, this is, again, an ongoing discussion about, do we have to, if there's a validated model, can we repurpose it in future? How often do you have to validate? Should we be revalidating a model, say, after 5 years, etc.? So these are all interesting questions which are still being debated. The accuracy of any algorithms and analysis used should be verifiable. And in the context of in silico trials using virtual patient cohorts, we felt that the in silico models should demonstrate fidelity to their real patient data counterparts or show comparative performance versus models using real data. Next slide, please. So, okay, that's the end. So Alex and Joe, it's over to questions.
Thank you so much. We have had a couple of questions come in. I don't know whether Alex has already answered. Saying that humans in clinical trials are models is a fundamental conceptual error. Humans in clinical trials are samples in physical reality, not models. Yeah. I think that's more of a comment, Alex, but I don't know whether you've already responded to that. Have you? In the chat?
I did, but would be useful if, in case there is further doubts. It's true. In a randomized controlled trials, the measurement is a physical measurement, but the point I was trying to make regarding modeling is that the randomized controlled trial is a model of how the performance of that particular product will be in the general population. That's where the model is. So you have evidence on a sample, and you're trying to make a generalization to the whole, to the universe, right? And the problem is that trials, the bigger they are, the more expensive they are, the longer they take. There are things that we simply need to wait time for accruing certain events. So is that the model that I was referring to in particular, as opposed to the fact that the humans themselves are the model. The same way that, for instance, for animal experiments, we are making an assumption that that animal experiment tells us something about what will happen in humans, or the bench test, that whatever we are measuring, that measurement is a reflection about something that will be reflected in the human performance as well.
Thanks, Alex. That's great. We have had another couple of questions come in. Have you developed these high-level principles yourselves?
So I can say that for the a-priori, we have not yet drafted these principles or published them. So this is work that we hope to undergo in the future. And there is some work undergoing in the UK where we have funding to establish centres for excellence in regulatory science and innovation. And once this is developed, we hope that that will really accelerate this work.
That's great. Thank you very much. We've had another couple of questions come in. Adoption of standards and frameworks, given the ASME VV40 2018 standards, introduction of a risk-informed credibility assessment framework for the verification and validation of computational models in medical devices. How can these frameworks be adapted or extended to broader in silico clinical trials? How do we ensure that these standards keep pace with the rapid advancements in computational methods?
Alex, do you want to go first and then I'll come in?
Yes, so we are working very closely with the colleagues that develop the ASME VMB40, and the FDA framework that I describe very cursorily is essentially based on the ASME VMB40. I believe that those what is needed still is to develop more praxis and more best practices in a sense, and grant more more experience, because there is a huge variety of interventions and products and devices and drugs, and it's difficult that a single particular set of practices will work for every scenario, right? But what, in general terms, what the ASME VMB40 says is that any complex systems can be broken down into subsystems, and you can do validation and verification at the component level, and then essentially you sort of propagate those uncertainties from there onwards. And the principles that were developed by FDA are specific for medical devices, so they are already associated to in silico trials. The concept of in silico trials, or the use of computational modeling and simulation in regulatory evidence, are different ways to refer to the same. And that's a bit the point that Pooja was making in her last slide, I think, about the importance of the notation, and that that we try to harmonize that in that regard.
Yeah. And just to add to what Alex has said, well, again, from a regulatory perspective, it makes sound sense to refer to whatever is out there already, and the ASME VV40 standards are a really good place to start. However, will anyone just adopt them as is from a regulatory perspective? No, because there are different considerations. We will have or that's what we always aspire to, is having this high-level principles-based approach. But then another important thing that we consider is context of use. So if you read the ASME VV40 right now, so things like, there are some regulatory questions which have come from questions that industry partners have asked us. It's like, I have a validated model. Will you accept this for this other purpose? Or this was validated so many years ago. Do I need to revalidate it? Do I have to verify the code every time? Who's going to do this? So there are all these questions, and there are differing levels of risk depending on what the medical product is, where it is intended, and also at which stage of the product life cycle you are presenting that simulation evidence. So it's a good place to start, and that will be considered, but it's not going to be adopted as is.
That's great. We have had a comment actually from the audience, I think, that responds to that. Absolutely agree. And each of them has different level of errors and uncertainty. We have had another question come in from the regulatory perspective. there must be a clear distinction between experimental data that is used for model calibration versus blind predictions of new physical measurements.
Yeah, that was, in fact, the answer you read first was the answer to that point that William made.
Okay.
Is correct. So there are measurements and then there are predictions, and each of them has different levels of uncertainties. In that sense, you could also argue that a physical measurement is an estimate of some underlying quantity, right, that we're trying to estimate. Yeah, so that needs to be, and this is part, I think, the point you're doing, William, you're making, I think is quite important and comes also in the FDA guidance as well, that you need to declare what your assumptions are. But I think that applies to pretty much every regulatory source of evidence, in the sense of, also if you use part of the measurements in a blind manner to develop thresholds, for instance, and then you do the trial, or if you're basically developing the thresholds as you develop the trial itself. I think this is all about declaring your assumptions and declaring at what points you are informing the model with measurements and at what points you're actually making sort of projections from those, which is essentially the point you're making there. Thank you.
And from a personal perspective, I can say I can only wholeheartedly agree.
Thank you very much. Okay, there is one more question. I have recently developed a V&V in-house and standard for hydrogen storage systems for my company. It is quite a complex task, but once it is accepted by the simulation team, the work becomes more interesting. We need simulation engineers to federate first. Sorry, I think that's more of a comment than a question.
Yeah. And I think that's the point, Bimal, also why we are so keen to develop this competence framework for this area, because a lot of these skills, if they were more predominant in the community that does as well as part of this work, will actually lead to an easier adoption and also to feel more comfortable with these techniques. So I think that federation, in a sense, also starts by developing what is the corpus of knowledge that they all share and the praxis associated with those.
Okay, that's lovely. I think that's a really nice place to finish up. So thank you so much for your time, Alex and Pooja. It was lovely to speak to you and work with you, and we shall see you all at the next NAFEMS webinar. Thanks everyone for attending today. Bye now.
Thank you.